We hear a lot about presidential power lately, but what can a president do and what are the limits to presidential power? Today, we're here with Dr. Scott Spitzer from the Political Science Program to break it all down for us. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here.
Let's start from the top. What's the actual job of a president in the United States?
Now, you would think that would be a really relatively straightforward answer. The problem here is that it's changed a lot, right? So, the original idea from the people who were writing our Constitution was that the president would be the officer who would execute the policies that were passed by the people's representative assembly in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, so that Congress would pass laws and the president would carry them out and make sure that they get implemented. But of course, presidents, we oftentimes think about presidents as leading the charge in terms of having a full legislative agenda, a plan for the country, a direction forward. In fact, in the 20th century, starting with Theodore Roosevelt, but essentially really with FDR, all presidents, we expect them to have a plan for the country. We look to the president to lead us. So what does a president do? Presidents are the chief executive officer of the United States, for those people who like to think about business metaphors. But as you know, any great CEO of any big corporation needs to chart a direction forward. So presidents set the tone. They are our chief executive. But they also lead us in interactions with every foreign uh, government and any foreign nation. They lead us in military efforts across the globe. So they're in charge of the United States of America's public face to the country as a whole, but also to the international world.
That's vague, right? So Congress, in the original vision, Congress passes a law. What were the tools of the president to actually execute those laws? What does execute mean?
Well, that's a great question. And in fact, I think that the people who wrote the Constitution were not exactly sure,
Mhm.
but they wrote things in the Article 2 of the Constitution like, he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Mhm.
So right away, we want to ask, what do we mean faithful? Faithful to who? Faithful to the congressional law that was passed, or faithful to the oath of office that he alone takes? I mean, he's the only officer of all of our elected people, of anybody, who has an oath written right there in the Constitution, just to preserve, protect, and the Constitution of the United States and the nation as a whole. And so presidents, even starting from George Washington, our
Mhm.
very first president, have interpreted this idea of they're the ones who are implementing the laws really broadly as and sort of, even though Congress has uh, sought to rein in presidents from time to time, particularly in the 19th century, and chart a way forward. Presidents have thought, it's my job to make this legislation real. And
Mhm.
so what do, right? And, early on, there was no bureaucracy. There was very little bureaucracy at the federal level. And so presidents would turn to state governments to implement these things, that would ask our military, where to the extent that we didn't even have a standing army. So presidents would call into being military, for wars and for other kinds of protecting and extending our western border as we moved across the continent. But it was by the time we got into the 20th century, presidents, starting with FDR, really had this full array of bureaucratic agencies that they could turn to, including their own staff in the executive office of the president, which was established in 1939. Roosevelt, FDR said, "Look, I'm doing all these big things now. I need help." And so Congress said, "Well, we don't want you to be that powerful that you have your own institutional uh, get-go."
Mhm.
But eventually, by 1939, well into his presidency, he got the executive office of the presidency passed, which gave him some agencies that helped him put together his budget, eventually helped him coordinate national security policy. The Office of the Trade Representative is in there. So all of the things we're hearing about in terms of tariffs and all those kinds of things, he's got a full staff in the executive office of the presidency now to do that. So started out just him figuring out how to do this, but now he's got a whole set of a lot of people who work with him, thousands of people who work for him.
And is it fair? Am I following you correctly? Um, is this bureaucracy geared towards helping him fulfill his role to execute laws? Or does the bureaucracy fit under this new vision where it's to help him figure out the mission and vision of the nation, or both, maybe?
Well, I think that you answered your own question. It is really more both.
Mhm.
So there's two sets of staffs or three sets of staffs that we can actually think of. We oftentimes talk about the institutional presidency in political science. So
Mm.
where did this come from? In the 20th century, it started with FDR and continued to develop. But really, we can start with the cabinet, right? Washington said, "I've got Alexander Hamilton at the Secretary of Treasury. I've
Mhm.
got Thomas Jefferson at the Secretary of State. They don't like, they don't see eye to eye. I don't want to say they don't like each other, but and he said, this is just the way I want it. They
Mhm.
will advise me and I'll make decisions. And that was the beginnings of what we call the cabinet, not
Mm.
in the Constitution, but it became today it is all of the top leaders of every single executive branch department. So
Mm.
there are 15 departments in the executive branch. Department of Treasury, Department of Justice, and all those people who lead those, like the Attorney General or the Secretary of Treasury or Secretary of State, are appointed by the president, confirmed by a majority vote of the Senate, and they report directly to the president. That cabinet sort of is they have these meetings, and those 15 leaders, plus the vice president, plus the national security director, they are his cabinet. But that's not really where he gets his advice. That's where he
Mm.
might keep his finger on the pulse of each of what's going on in the Department of Health and Human Services, what's going on in the Department of Defense. But really, that's part one, the cabinet, right? It's a representational kind of body, really, for the huge $6 trillion federal executive branch. Then the second piece is what I just talked about, is executive office of the president. Those are full staffs that are there to give him the best possible information just for the president, right? This is geared to helping, like there's the Council of Economic Advisors, for example, and there's the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And so these are people, the Office of Management and Budget.
Mhm.
These are people thousands of people basically in that executive office of the president, who work to provide the president of the United States with the best possible, most accurate information. And then there's a third group of people, and those are the people that the president brings with him.
Mm.
It used to be a nephew,
Mhm.
or but now it's if you've seen the show, one of my favorite old shows, The West Wing.
Mm.
This is the West Wing. These are his policy advisors, his speech writers, his researchers, his congressional liaisons, his people who work with different interest groups like women or African Americans or business community, right? So he has people in the West Wing, or the White House staff, as it's known, that hundreds of those who really are there to assist him in putting together his program and to advance his goals, not just to implement his policies. So.
Mhm. What are the resources the president has to execute these laws?
Well, that's a great question. Presidents today have a very large institutional presidency. We can break that up into three parts, right? There's the executive office of the presidency, which consists of agencies like the Office of Management and Budget that helps him with his budget, or the National Security Agency, which helps him coordinate all of our national security. Then there's his White House staff. Those are the people who really assist the president in his the way he comes up with his whole political agenda, his speeches, research on things, outreach to different groups. And then there's the cabinet, which is really, something that emerged right away with President Washington, and it helps him keep tabs on all of the leaders, right? It's the collection of all the leaders of all of the executive branch departments. And so that cabinet is a way for the president to sort of keep tabs on the functioning of the entire executive branch as a whole. So what your original question is, what does he use to execute things? All of it, right? So he's constantly thinking. A president is not a king, in case you didn't realize that.
Mhm.
So presidents can't give orders and just say, I'm just going to tell the executive branch to do this, do that, and they'll just do it. No, a president, as Richard Neustadt famously said, must persuade. They have to use their leverage, use the fact that they're the only nationally elected politician, use the fact that they command the bully pulpit, they speak to the entire nation and to the entire world, to leverage pressure on those people he wants to do his bidding, right? If he wants to get a law or set of budget cuts implemented, he's got to convince those people who are going to do that it's in their interests to cooperate and to carry out his wishes. That's not always easy. Sometimes it's very easy. Sometimes it's challenging.
Yeah. This nation was founded on the rejection of a monarchy. Now, a monarch has a lot more direct power, but our president does not. What tools does our president have, and how does he work around the limitation on these tools?
Well, that's a great question. And the people who wrote the Constitution, remember, our Constitution comes 11 years after we've already declared independence.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the failures of that first government, the Articles of Confederation that we had, was that there was no executive. There was nobody to make things happen. And we failed. And so they came back to empower this person, but they were still worried about this issue of liberty and having an authoritarian, they wouldn't have used that word, but monarchical piece. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, who wrote a defense of the precedents that they had created, saying it's not a king, he's not a king, and here's the ways that he's not a king, very specifically. So almost everything that a president does is checked by the power of the other two branches. He can't even appoint his own leaders of the executive branch agencies that he's got to use to carry out the laws without getting consent of the entire Senate, a majority of the Senate. He can't get people on the U.S. courts without getting consent from the Senate. If a law is, if he wants to get a law passed, he's got to ask somebody in the Congress to introduce it, and he's got to hope that they implement, pass the kind of law that he would like. But he's not actually a legislator. The one thing he can do is he can hold over their heads this idea of a veto, right? If you do something that I absolutely disagree with, I can veto it. But he cannot do as Governor Newsom could do, take out a single line. Can't do that. All or nothing. If he likes that law, doesn't like some of it, he's got to decide, I'll sign it into law, or I'll veto it.
Yeah. Can a president pass laws?
No, presidents cannot pass laws by themselves. Now, when we pass a law in the United States of America, it has to pass by a majority vote in our House of Representatives. There's 435 people in the House of Representatives, each representing uniquely a different area of the country, representing about 750,000 people, and 100 senators. It's got to pass the Senate by a majority, and it's got to be exactly the same in the House and the Senate. Then it comes to the president, and the president can sign that bill into law. It becomes law. The president can do nothing. If he does nothing and Congress continues to go, it becomes law, with or without the president. So now he could veto that piece of legislation. And when he says, I'm vetoing it, he issues a statement, I don't like this, then that law is no longer law. Now, even then, though, the Congress can override his veto by voting by 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to override the president's veto, and then it still becomes law even if the president didn't like it. Now, there's one other branch. It's the judicial branch that we oftentimes think about the Supreme Court. There's other courts as well. There's, 13 appellate courts, 12 if you're thinking geographically, and then there's also 94 federal district courts. And those judges can say, hey, you know what? That law that you guys just passed and the president signed violates some key principle in our Constitution, and therefore we think it's no longer a law. And when a court says that, especially the Supreme Court, it's no longer law. So presidents have to work with those other branches of government if they would like to see changes in the country.
Great. What would be an example of a law passed by Congress?
Well, that's a great, we should remember that California can pass laws. So can your local cities can have ordinances. But when we talk about national laws, it governs everybody in the entire country. And oftentimes we're talking about policies. So most people are pretty familiar with Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. And that was a law that was passed in the Congress, signed by President Obama, that made sure to close the gap between those people who were getting insurance in the private market, health insurance, and those people who were uninsured, and those people who are getting insurance already by other federal national programs. So this is a national policy implemented by the national government that all states and cities are now obligated to follow.
You're telling me presidents can't pass laws, and at the same time, we're hearing all the time about executive orders. Aren't those laws?
Well, in a way, they are, Jessica. You know, our president has the power to implement any law that has been passed. And so presidents, right, Congress doesn't tell the president how many offices to open to implement Social Security, or where the affordable care centers will be, right? So presidents implementing those laws will, right, those agencies typically will just issue all sorts of administrative regulations, which basically are the rules that have the force of law to carry out the policies that have already been passed by law. Now, a president, because he runs the entire government, he's the chief executive, can order those agencies to do things to carry out any existing law. Now, he has to base that in some authority that already existing in a piece of a law that's already been passed, or his existing constitutional authority as commander in chief, for example. It says in the Constitution, the president's the commander in chief of our armed forces. So presidents can, for example, President Truman issued an executive order during World War II to desegregate our U.S. Army. Which was, right, racial segregation was the law in many southern states. And the president of the United States decided our armed forces fighting abroad in Europe and other places in the Pacific theater should be desegregated. And so because he's commander in chief, he did not need to go to Congress to get that passed as a law. So presidents like Biden and Trump will issue an executive order to tell us how to enforce immigration law, for example. Or not to enforce certain aspects of the immigration law, like President Obama said when he issued the executive order establishing the DACA program, right? Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. That was an executive order. You know what the shortcoming of an executive order is, though? The next president can just issue another executive order, which undoes the previous president's executive orders. Very hard to do that with an existing law that's already been passed by Congress and signed by the president. You've got to pass a whole nother law to go through the Congress and the presidency again to undo what a previous law did. The other thing about executive orders is they can be overturned by a court, just like a law can be overturned by the federal courts as unconstitutional. If the president issues an executive order and the courts say, hey, you've exceeded your bounds, there is no legislative authority, there's no legal authority that you have under an existing law to do that action. For example, I'll give you a great example. President Trump has said, we're going to stop spending this money on all these programs, U.S. aid, for example, Agency for International Development. And so a lot of those executive agents said, wait, Congress passed a law which is called a budget. That's a law in the United States of America. That's how we have our U.S. budget. It's a series of laws. And it said you're going to spend this many billions and billions of dollars on the Agency for International Development. And so the president is the chief executive. He can't just say, no, I'm not going to do that. And so the courts have said repeatedly, you have to spend the money that's already been budgeted and already been passed in law. So executive orders are like a law, but they're much, much more easily challenged.
Am I understanding correctly that every executive order is pinning back to a law passed by Congress or constitutional presidential authority? So the president is allowed to use an executive order based on the premise that he's allowed to execute his roles as execute laws that exist. Am I understanding that correctly?
That is absolutely correct. But now, of course, Congress writes laws in ways that provide a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah.
So if, when the president's told to enforce immigration under immigration law, how many agents will be hired by Homeland Security under ICE and where they will be positioned and all that, that's not what Congress decided. Congress said, here's the law, enforce it. President now decides how that will take place. And those can be, agency decisions usually. But sometimes the president can intervene and say, no, I want to move all of these agents away from other places and put them on our southern border, and we're going to build a wall. And President Trump did that in his first term, and he's doing that again.
Okay. What is an executive order?
That's a great question because we see a lot of them, right? And people are always wondering. Executive orders are orders given by the President of the United States that tell agencies, executive branch organizations, Department of Defense organizations, Department of Treasury, Department of State, agriculture, how to do what they're supposed to do. So presidents have to draw on an existing law
Mhm.
that's already given them the authority that they're supposed to implement this law. But they can say to the agencies how to do it. And so those are executive orders. They can also claim that authority under their constitutional powers, right? So that he's the commander in chief, for example, in the Constitution. So he can issue executive orders governing how the armed forces do their work.
Are there any shortcomings to executive orders?
Well, I mean, there's two big ones, right? The first one is it sometimes seems that presidents are doing these large things without any check on their authority, right? So a president, it almost feels like a president can interpret a law that he has authority on and do something that has, like, it's almost like a new law, right? But it's not a new law. It's under the authority of an existing law or his constitution. So that's the first thing. But they can be checked, right? So the next president can issue another executive order to undo it. And both Biden did that to the first president, Trump, and Trump did that to the Biden executive order. So that happens very quickly. So if you're trying to establish something that's going to have a longer term impact on the country's direction, an executive order might not be the best way to do that. Secondly, courts, they can overturn laws, but they can also overturn executive orders when a president has exceeded his authority. They can say, hey, this is unconstitutional. You don't have the authority to issue that executive order.
By design, the president was not powerful in the original framing. Feels super powerful right now. Like, how did we get here, and what are the benefits and costs?
Well, I mean, I would say, first of all, the president was always thought of as powerful, but the framers were really uneasy with that power, right? They didn't want to get into the land of another king, but they also didn't want to be in a place where they couldn't execute the laws of the land, how they experienced that during the Articles of Confederation. So there's a lot of room for interpretation. So presidents in the 19th century really allowed, for the most part, there were exceptions to the rule. There was George Washington, there was Andrew Jackson, there was Abraham Lincoln, possibly the most powerful president we've ever had. Really, a lot of people say he was a constitutional dictator because he was fighting to preserve the country and upending and requirements under the Constitution as in that process. But I think that the real issue is that as the country has become more complex, as we've gone through the Industrial Revolution and we've become a global leader after World War II, right? The idea of leading a country this large with this much wealth, with this much military power, we're the number one military in the world, we're the number one economy in the world, and we have an incredibly diverse population, rural, urban, racially, ethnically, everything, that falls upon, we expect our presidents to lead that country. So they have to be powerful enough to do that. So on the one hand, it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, when there's a crisis, we don't say, I wish Congress would fix this crisis. When COVID happened, we didn't say, oh my God, Congress. We said, oh my God, President Trump and President Biden, please do something, solve this crisis. And so in a way, whenever there's a crisis, and of course there's always going to be, and there will be, president's authority emerges as, expands. And the next president doesn't say, oh, I don't want that power, thank you. No, they continue that. And so that's how our presidential authority has grown and grown and grown. But it has challenged us because the original balance, as you point out, was of three co-equal branches: the Congress, the presidency, the judiciary, with checks on the power of each one so that no one branch could be so powerful as to overwhelm the entire system. But we're at this point right now where it feels like, and many of my colleagues would agree with me on this, that the presidency has grown so powerful and that President Trump has found a need to push that even further so that it challenges that whole balance that he can't be checked effectively by the Congress. He can't be checked effectively by our courts.
Why? What is happening there? Why isn't Congress and why aren't the courts checking the presidential power right now? Do you have any theories or have you heard any theories?
Well, there are two answers to that. Let's talk about the Congress. The big thing with the Congress is we're in a new era of deeply polarized parties, right? What I mean by that is that if you're a Democrat in Congress, you are completely in disagreement with every single Republican in Congress. So they are so far apart on every single issue, all the Republicans and all the Democrats in our Congress, that they can't agree on anything. And so one of the problems is that the party of which the president's from doesn't want to check the power of the president that is their president. So the Democrats didn't really want to check the authority of President Biden. This is even more the case, accentuated even further with Republicans not wanting to really step in the way of President Trump's agenda and his success. On the judiciary front, actually, we are finding that our courts are pretty effective in issuing decisions, including the Supreme Court, that has said, you can't do this, right? There have been a number of federal courts have said, President Trump, you have to spend the money that's already been budgeted. And even the Supreme Court has told President Trump that the deportation to El Salvador, to an El Salvador prison of Kilmar Abrigo Garcia, he had to be returned. Now, of course, the courts can say these things, but then the president has to follow the courts. And this has brought our system to a crisis level. So in the Congress, the Republican majority in the House, the Republican majority in the Senate has been reluctant to do anything to step in the way of President Trump's agenda. So they don't check his power very effectively. And the courts might issue decisions that tell the president, you've gone too far, but then the president has to respond to that, has to say, oh, you've said I've gone too far. Okay, I'll pull back. Alexander Hamilton, again, another one of my favorite writers, said, don't worry about the judiciary. They don't have much power. They have neither the power of the sword nor the purse. They can't pull money and they can't enforce their rulings. And so we are in this conundrum, right? We've always said, oh, the court says something, that's like law. That is like law. It's authoritative. The court's interpretation of the Constitution, the Supreme Court's, is the authoritative interpretation. Every other court has to follow it. All the executive branches, governors, everybody has to follow that. But if the president says, I don't want to follow that, what do we do?
For those who are worried about the extreme presidential power we're seeing right now, do you have any solutions?
Well, yeah. I mean, there are a number of features of our political system that help us deal with this. Now, of course, the Constitution itself offers some solutions. There's the nuclear button of impeachment, which has never been effective because we've never been able to remove a president from power, because presidents who are elected to the presidency will not have, they will most likely not have 2/3 of the U.S. Senate being willing to remove them from power, which is what is necessary. But there are other things that can happen. Congress can check the power of the presidency when they feel that the president is exceeded his bounds. And under our circumstances right now, with the Republican majority not being willing to do that, feeling that they would like to see the president, their president, continue down this path, courts can do things. In addition, state governments can act in different ways that resist. For example, a number of attorney generals throughout the country, state attorney generals, have sued the president of the United States and said, you have to spend the money that you've already budgeted that makes, most states get about 20 to 30% of their state budget comes from the federal government. So states are really in trouble with cuts that have come down from the federal government unilaterally. So they won that lawsuit. And even this morning, there's another federal judge again that says you've got to spend that money. You can't stop spending money that's already been passed by law, that's been already signed by a president before you, to spend that money. The third thing, though, the real big thing is that we are a democracy, And even though we're imperfectly a democracy, and no democracy is perfect, the people really hold all the cards. If the public decides this president is too much, gone too far, we don't like it, they can do things like elect different people to Congress, ask their own state government to do things, right? Hold protests, write letters, and shift the nature of the political culture at this point, where it becomes less and less possible for this president to easily just expand his power.
Great. At this point, the Republican Congress seems unwilling to push back against a Republican president. Are there any fissures in that support?
Well, I'm glad you said at this point, right? So one of the things we're noticing is that approval numbers, right, for the president of the United States have been declining. And as Republicans in Congress start to look at special elections for state legislature, for House of Representatives, that where the returns are much smaller for the Republican than they were just a few months ago in the 2024 election. Those were districts that President Trump would win by a lot larger margins, for example. And then the House Republican who replaced an appointment, or somebody who resigned, still won, but by a lot less, right? So members of Congress who are Republicans are starting, will start to think, I want to get reelected. I want to support my president, but I also want to get reelected. And if I start to think that supporting all these policies, which are very unpopular in public opinion polls, by supporting these policies without standing up to them, I'm going to possibly lose my next election. When they start to see it that way, they're likely to put some separation between themselves and Trump. Not on every issue, not on everything, but maybe on some of the spending on healthcare, like Medicaid funding and things like that, which many Republican constituents who vote Republican, regularly rely on those programs. They don't want to see those cut. Those are really unpopular. So if members of the House of Representatives who are Republicans say, you know what, I'm a little worried about my next reelection, they may start to break with the Trump administration on key policies.
When will the next elections be?
Well,
what are we looking at?
Yeah, the problem with that is that a lot of Republicans will say, you know what, my election isn't until 2026, so I've got time. I'll give you a great example of this. I was just teaching about this the other day. When President Reagan came into office in 1980, he won the 1980 election, and in 1981 he put in place some draconian budget cuts in social welfare programs, huge cuts, and they weren't so popular. The public started to lose public approval, and then the country went into a recession. In 1981, 1982, we were in a recession, and President Reagan's popularity went down quite a bit, below 40%. What happened? He came back 2 years later in 1984 and won a landslide presidential election because the economy bounced back. People forgot about those draconian budget cuts. They focused on some other aspects. Unemployment was low. Inflation had been reduced. And so members of Congress right now may say, yeah, these are unpopular policies, but Trump is still Trump. He won the last election. Nobody thought he could win. Maybe we just wait this out and continue to support him and see where this ends up in a year from now.
Yeah. Are there places where it feels like Trump is taking the Republican Party in a different direction?
Well, whoever is the president of the United States, they're also the leader of their political party. When it was Obama was president, the Democratic Party became the party of Barack Obama. And when Trump became president in 2016 and then again now in 2025, the Republican Party is clearly the Donald Trump Republican Party. And it has been that way for some time, right? Even during the Biden years. And I would say, what's interesting about that is that Donald Trump's policy priorities depart from traditional Republican Party policy priorities in a lot of key ways. let's take the tariffs, for example. He's very fond of using these tariffs to renegotiate the the United States trade relationships with China and with other countries, pretty much everybody, with Canada, with Mexico. And the Republican Party has been the party of free trade. It was the Democratic Party who said we should have limits on free trade. And so have Donald Trump erecting these very high, prohibitively high tariffs is counter to the last 50 years of Republican Party policy. And yet, Republicans in Congress, Republican leaders in states have said, oh, no, we like these tariffs. This is where we want to go. Second area in foreign policy, the Republican Party under Ronald Reagan was the one who said, the Soviet Union was the evil empire, and that we are really see the Soviets and then Russia afterwards as a competitor, as Vladimir Putin as somebody who represents a threat to the United States interests. And here, this president said, no, I want to ally myself more and more and more with the interests of Russia, particularly in this war with Ukraine, and that war in a way that really Russia benefits much more than in Ukraine. That's very different than the leadership of the Republican Party has been for the last 50 years.
How does a U.S. president differ from a prime minister?
That's a really important question. Right, under a parliamentary system where we have prime ministers, all of the people in their Congress, which is their legislature, are called ministers of parliament. The prime minister is somebody who's in the parliament. That'd be like having John Thune, who's the majority leader of the Senate, be your executive leader, right? So how does that happen? When they have elections in England, for example, in the UK, people vote for political parties. And whichever political party has when at the end of the election has the majority of the seats in their national legislature will form a government. And they will elect from themselves one of their people to be their prime minister, and that person will lead the government. Now, what's very interesting about that is that once you have a prime minister with the majority of the support in the parliament, they can kind of move very quickly to implement their policy priorities. Whereas in the United States, the president is elected separately under a different electorate than the individual members of the House, each elected in smaller districts, and the U.S. senators, each elected in a state. And so there's a natural break between what the president might want to do and what the members of the House might prefer and what the members of the U.S. Senate might prefer, even when they're all from the same political party.
News recently broke that the president accepted a fancy airplane from Qatar. What does our Constitution say about this?
Well, our Constitution actually says very specifically presidents are not supposed to accept what they call emoluments, which is basically the idea from other foreign leaders. And the point is, we don't want our president to be bribed. We want our president to focus on the interests of the public. If someone's giving you a gift, right, it makes you like them. And we definitely don't want the gift and the flattery that comes with that to be the thing that convinces our president to change how we interact with other countries. This one is particularly interesting because President Trump is about to embark on a Middle East trip where anybody who's watching this knows that there's been this ongoing tremendous war between Israel and Hamas and the Gaza Strip, and Qatar, which gave the president this giant $400 million airplane, is been frequently the broker of peace negotiations or hostage negotiations between Israel, Hamas leaders, and the United States, and with Egypt too. And so for Qatar to be giving a huge gift to President Trump on the eve of his trip out to the Middle East suggests that he might be compromised, right? And so the Constitution suggests that he should say no, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spitzer, for helping us understand presidential power. If students want to learn more from you, what do you teach?
Well, I teach a whole range of classes. I teach Introduction to American Politics every semester. I'm teaching social welfare policy and politics and policymaking next semester. I teach classes on media and politics, the politics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and of course, the presidency.